Hey, today I want to talk about the difference between an amateur mix and a professional mix, and how do you go from an amateur mix to a professional mix. It's probably a little bit different than you think. There's three main things that basically set a threshold, and if you cross that threshold, if you hit these three things, you cross a threshold where most listeners, average listeners, aren't going to be able to tell the difference between your mix that you made in a home studio and a completely professional mix. So these three things are really the key to going from amateur to professional. And in today's video, we're going to listen through each. I'm going to give you audio examples of each so you can really hear the differences in what you should be listening for in your mixes. Now, before we even get into it, a couple things up top. First of all, is that if you're struggling to get a mix that you're happy with, I want to give you something completely free. It's my 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It just goes through the 6 steps that all professional mixes have and how to do them. You can download it for free from the link in the description below. It's really going to help you out. If you're struggling to get a mix, please download it. It's going to help you out. And it will, if you go through it, it's basically going to guide you into hitting all three of these things. The second is that how this came about. I want to give you a little bit of backstory to this. So this came about in my home studio community. I have a private community of just my closest students. It's currently closed, but there's a link in the description below where you can join the wait list. We'll reopen again in January. But in that community, one of my students shared that she had 2 mixes, one that was her mix and one that she'd hired a professional to do. And she was struggling. She could tell that the professionals was better, but she was really struggling to identify what made it better. And so I walked through basically, hey, if you just hit these 3 things with your mix, it's going to get you up to that professional mix. Those are the 3 things that they're really doing that you're not doing in your amateur mix. And I realized, thinking about it, this is kind of what I've heard from all of my students. So what I wanted to do in today's video is take one of my mixes, this mix down here, a pro mix, and put it up against an amateur mix. And what I did, as opposed to sharing a student mix, is I just took my mix and did all the main mistakes that I hear all of my students making. It's like an amalgamation of the biggest things I hear in student mixes that is holding them back. And what I want to highlight is the 3 things that are going to get you up to a professional mix. Now, this video is going to be a little bit more DIY. For some reason, my normal software isn't working for video stuff, but that's okay. We're going to get just as much value in. It's just not going to have fancy edits or anything like that. It's going to be a little bit more DIY. So let's talk about the first one, which is a balanced mix. This is number 1. This is super important, is that your mix is balanced across your volumes, so relative volumes to each other. Nothing is way too loud relative to something that's too quiet in terms of how it should feel in the mix. The second is panning, so your stereo field, so your mix shouldn't really be leaning off to one side, or that's going to be really distracting. No professional mix just leans for the entire mix or even for a large section of the mix. You might do it for a second here or there, but it's not going to do it for a really extended period of time. And then third is the tone. Think your EQ from your subs all the way up to your high frequencies. It should be balanced across the entire tone. And on most mixes, this kind of looks like a gentle curve from the subs and low end down up through the high end. So we'll look at that as well. Let's go and listen through each of these, and we're going to compare to the amateur mix up here to the pro mix down here. And just listen, starting with the volume, then with kind of how the stereo field, how does it feel across left to right, and then the tone. What do you notice in terms of low end, mid-range, and high end? So this is the amateur mix. This is the pro mix. Pull up the EQ so you can kind of see what it looks like across the frequency spectrum. Back to the amateur mix. The pro mix. Amateur mix. So notice that the amateur mix falls off up here. There's not nearly as much of this, 3K and above, except for the S's and harsh sounds. The pro mix is a lot more balanced all the way up into the upper mid-range. Right? So in terms of tone, that's one of the biggest things you're going to notice, that there's more upper mid-range presence. It feels a little bit brighter. There's a little bit too much low end in the amateur mix. There's a little bit more even tone in the professional mix. In terms of volume, you might notice that the vocals feel way too quiet, like they're tucked way too far back compared to our vocals that are sitting right at the front of the mix. And some of the guitars are a little bit off. The drums are a little bit too quiet. There's not as much punch and presence from those types of things. And then in terms of panning, you'll notice that the bass is leaning off to one side. So you can even see it visually here that the right ear, this bottom line here, is louder than the left ear. So the mix feels like it's just kind of leaning constantly. Right? Just leaning, a lot more even, a lot more balanced. Okay, So balance, that's number one. That's super, super key. If you just get your balance right, your mix is going to feel a whole lot better. Number two is that it highlights the key elements. So in most songs, this is your vocal, any sort of lead guitar, lead synth, anything like that. But it's also in most songs the kick and the snare. And a lot of people miss this. One of the number one pieces of feedback I'm giving to students is that, hey, if you want this rock mix to really feel like a rock mix, you got to bring that kick and snare up, or this hip hop mix, or even really any genre of music. In a lot of songs, the rhythmic elements should be up more in line with the vocals. In some mixes, they're actually louder than the vocals, but because they're short, just a quick hit, they can sit louder without seeming louder than the vocal. The vocal can sit technically a little bit lower, but in a lot of cases, I'm mixing them roughly even. A super big trick for this is just mix them first. Set your volume levels for those first, and then mix in around them, and it's going to be a lot easier to get those things to shine through at the front of your mix. So highlighting the key elements. This is also done through EQ. If you have a lot of mud that's making it kind of sound muddy and washed out, then it's going to be like harder to identify it as a key element. So if we go back and forth again really quickly between these two mixes, let's go to this section right here and listen to the amateur mix and then over to the pro mix. Notice how the vocal is very upfront and present. The kick and the snare is a lot more obvious and upfront. It's highlighted. Now, some mixes you might want that feel of a bit of distance. That's less about the style here and more just about the fact that I can very clearly identify that that is the lead element. So here's the amateur mix compared to the pro mix. It kind of feels like that I should be focusing on the guitar. That's pulling my attention more than the vocal. And then we get to this section, it's really hard to tell. It's a lot easier to tell in this version. That guitar is really distracting me. It really feels kind of like the lead element when that's just a rhythm guitar. It shouldn't be the lead element. So very clearly identifying and highlighting the lead element is crucial. And then the kick and the snare, the difference between the kick and the snare in this amateur mix to the pro mix. Go back and listen to a bunch of your favorite records and pay attention to the kick and the snare. In some genres, it might not be as, like this is almost aggressive kick and snare. That's totally fine. Some genres, it's going to be a little bit less, but the bigger point is that it's going to be highlighted and it's going to be clear that it's a highlighted element. Okay, so number two is highlighting the key elements. And then number three is that it's removing any distractions. Now, number one and number two, all of those things could be distractions for the listener. So just nailing your balance, just nailing that you're highlighting the key elements is going to reduce distractions already. But then you want to go one level deeper and try to identify, is there anything specific that's kind of grating at my ear, pulling my ear? If you listen to the amateur mix, you'll notice that there's just kind of a lot of upper end harshness that's really distracting, especially as we get into this chorus here. So as this chorus comes in, notice how the guitars in particular have this harshness to them. Kind of like that. Compared to this mix is brighter, but it doesn't feel as harsh and as grating. Now, harshness is a huge one. This could also be S's and sh's and any sort of harshness on the vocals. It also could just be, that the vocal's a little bit out of tune. You might just need to tighten up the timing on the vocal or the tuning on the vocal. Maybe you tune it. Maybe you need to re-record it. Could be just that the hits are a little bit off in timing from each other. So removing any of those distractions, any of that harshness, any of the obvious distractions in terms of performance, is going to free up the listener just to be able to enjoy the song. So it should feel balanced across the volume, the pan, stereo field, and tone. It should highlight the key element, and it should remove any sort of distraction. And if you do those three things, then your mix is going to feel way, way, way more balanced, and it's going to be able to be enjoyed by the listener. And most listeners aren't going to be able to tell if it's a professional mix or a mix that you did at your home studio, because that threshold, as long as you're hitting those things to the best of your ability, is enough for most listeners. And then most audiophiles also, if you're hitting those things well enough, that's going to cross their threshold. And then everything beyond that is just about preference. What do you want this mix to be? Now, real quick, if you don't already have that 6-step checklist to a pro mix, be sure to grab it. It's going to help you do all three of these things. And if you've been struggling with this, if you've been struggling across this threshold, I'd love to hear if this was helpful for you. With simplifying this into these three core areas, does it make mixing feel a little bit easier, a little bit more attainable to you? Definitely let me know. I'd also love to hear if there's anything that you feel like I missed in this video. Let me know in the comments below. If this video is helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.